Thank you very much for joining us today. We have the pleasure to have a talk today from Patrick Lacroix, or Patrick Lacroix, however it's pronounced. Either way, who will be talking to us on l'Acadie de la Valle, the interface area in northern Maine up into New Brunswick. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Patrick.
Terrific. Thank you so much for the invitation and for this opportunity. It's great to see familiar faces from near and far. I really appreciate that. People coming in to hear a little bit about l'Acadie, drawn partly from my research and my work here at the Acadian Archives. I'm also excited to see a bunch of new faces. So this is wonderful, and people from all over the place, as Eric was mentioning. So thank you. And I look forward to hearing from you. Typically, I love to have like a lot of engagement. So I'll try to make my presentation brief, and then we can have a conversation about whatever questions you may have or things I might have left out. So without further ado, at my end, there we are. So hopefully you can all see that. So again, thank you. Just a quick outlook on what I'm going to be presenting today. So there are a few different chapters to my presentation. First, we'll talk about what I would call the prehistory of Valle Acadian culture, meaning the history of Acadia in the colonial period. So we'll talk about, what happens in the 1600s and 1700s. And many of you will undoubtedly be acquainted with that story, but I just want to lay the foundation for what happens later on and in different geographical spaces up in northern Maine and northwestern New Brunswick. After that, having explored some of those dimensions through maps specifically, we'll engage with the topic through some of our items here that we have at the Acadian Archives in Fort Kent. I've digitized some of them, so we'll be able to explore those. And they offer really neat tidbits, neat insights into the evolution of a culture once it kind of settles and develops in northern Maine on American soil. We'll mostly talk about Maine Acadians here, but a lot of that is transferable to what's happening on the other side of the border or the other side of the river in New Brunswick. And then I'll conclude, if we have enough time, with just a few words about the Acadian Archives. That's not the focus of the talk, but some of you might be interested in learning more about Acadians in New England and where to find more resources. And we can definitely help with that. So you'll see here, l'Acadie de la Valle, the title of my talk. We'll talk about how hybrid it is. It's certainly a borderland community, and we'll explore that in at least a few sentences a little bit later on. I also want to acknowledge, as we get going, that this is the land of the Wolastoqiyik people, often referred to as Maliseets, which is a name that's been essentially given to them by some of their neighbors. But they self-identify as Wolastoqiyik, and they have an ancestral and historic presence on both sides of the St. John River. In fact, in their own language, it is the Woolastoq River or the Beautiful River. So these are the people of the Beautiful River, and Maliseets or Wolastoqiyik still inhabit our land. They have several communities, one notably just outside of Edmundston in New Brunswick, and one outside of Houlton in Maine. So I want to acknowledge that, and they are also a part of the Wabanaki Alliance. For those wanting to learn more about the Wabanaki presence in Maine and Eastern Canada, the Alliance is a great place to start. If you just Google that, they also have the Abbey Museum based here in Maine, and they have terrific online resources. And they do a lot of advocacy work around land sovereignty. I mentioned all this because this could be a 15-week course on the Wolastoqiyik. It won't be, of course. It won't even be a full hour on the Wolastoqiyik, but I do want to acknowledge the Indigenous presence that has played such an important role and formative role in the making of the Acadian experience in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Maine. All right, so let's move ahead just to give you again a general impression of what we're going to be discussing. There are various Acadian communities across the U.S. First, and we'll talk about the deportation in who knows, maybe 10 minutes or so. So the deportation is one of those formative events that leads to the establishment of a diasporic Acadian culture in various places around the Atlantic world, from France, momentarily in Britain, Eastern Canada, Quebec, Maine, various places in the 13 colonies, Maryland, one that has an enduring presence, same in Philadelphia and Eastern Pennsylvania, and of course, Louisiana as well. All those places, or nearly all of those places, are beyond the scope of this talk today. Um, and you can see there with the green check marks what I'll be discussing. So we'll talk very briefly about the deportation and the colonization, of course, of the Upper St. John Valley. That's the valley that's in the title of this talk. And I also want to mention that this establishment of Acadian communities occurs on U.S. soil, occurs over the course of centuries. Most recently, if we're talking about waves of migration, with a fairly concerted migration towards industrial centers, textile producing centers, some shoemaking centers in various parts of New England, Old Town, Rumford being pulp and paper predominantly as a producing center, Fitchburg, New Bedford, Waltham, Massachusetts. There are more, there are a lot more actually, but this gives you a sense of the geographical breadth of Acadian culture. And each of these communities or subcultures would deserve its own study. So we're getting the ball rolling with the Acadians of the St. John Valley today, and hopefully it will encourage further research and maybe invite you to explore some of these other diasporic communities. Okay, so going back more than a few centuries at this point, the land that we now recognize as Maine and New Brunswick, and of course the Upper St. John River Valley, where I'm located, that was all part of the Wabanaki homeland, which included the Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Abenaki, Mi'kmaq, and Wolastoqiyik peoples. So people who were tied together through linguistic connections. They had their own dialects, but they were to a great extent mutually intelligible, a lot of trade, a lot of commerce, and all felt the devastating impact of colonization beginning in the early 17th century through disease, epidemics, war, competition for resources, the ravages of alcohol and firearms in their communities, loss of land. So all those things had a major impact on the relationship and the approach that they would have towards the colonizing powers over time. A relationship that was built on compromises and sometimes very difficult compromises and sacrifices. So I do want to acknowledge that really quickly. Unfortunately, I don't have time, as I mentioned earlier, to delve into deeply Indigenous French relations, but that's something that increasingly, luckily, scholars are looking into. One myth that I will, and I use the term very loosely, that I hear very often has to do with the friendly relations between the Mi'kmaq or Mi'kmaq, all depending on where you're located. And Maine, we tend to say Mi'kmaq, and the common usage in Canada is Mi'kmaq, but these were, as you can see from this map, the ancestral occupants of what is today Nova Scotia. And certainly they enjoyed friendly relations overall with the French people, but there was certainly competition over resources, especially land, as these Acadians increasingly encroach on traditional hunting grounds and fishing areas along the coast and further inland as the population grew and grew quickly in late 17th century and early 18th century. So all that had an impact on those relationships and creating tension. And that tension really bubbles up in the 1740s and 50s when the indigenous peoples are much more committed to metropolitan France and much less impressed or interested in by the neutrality of Acadians. And increasingly, there's pressure exerted on the neutral Acadians to ally themselves with metropolitan France, when in fact they prefer to stay aloof of the conflict. But we'll get into the deportation and its lead up in just a few minutes. I do want to share a few more maps before we get there. So there are beautiful maps that were created now years and years ago that are hosted online. So this is available online for free for anyone who wants to use this for educational purposes. That shows you as it says, the colonization or settlement of Acadia, but also voyages of exploration that were undertaken by Champlain. And I know that not too long ago, you had a talk by Eric Thierry, who was talking about Champlain has a brand new book out. So that's something worth exploring. And really, we tend to start the story of colonial Acadia in 1604 and 1605, and a devastating winter spent at St. Croix Island. which you can see here. It's kind of in the middle of the map, a little bit above center vertically, which is at the mouth of St. Croix Island, being at the mouth of the St. Croix River and Passamaquoddy Bay. And so for about 4 months, French settlers that, are trying to build a colony at that location just face the ravages of starvation, scurvy, and it's just not the right location. They thought that building on an island in 1604, 1605 would be the right move. They wanted to be somewhat insulated from possible attacks by indigenous nations, but ultimately they're just trapped by the ice, by the weather, by the lack of supplies. And the following spring, they moved to Port Royal across the bay, which is in Nova Scotia. And the habitation that we see in the little square box there at the bottom has been rebuilt, recreated. You can visit it today. It's part of Canada's national parks, and it looks almost exactly. In fact, this little cartoon or vignette was used to rebuild the entire thing. So they were inspired by this drawing made by Champlain to rebuild the settlement there. It's just across the bay from Annapolis Royal, which is also worth visiting today. So from 1605 onwards, Port Royal is really the center of Acadian life, even though there will be competing claims to the colony, and increasingly you'll have other powers vying for ownership for its resources, but also for the sheer purpose of competing with other powers and controlling key passageways. So anyway, as I say, even though typically we start the story of Acadian 1604 with this, you know, tragic winter and the building of Port Royal the next year, really it's not until the 1630s, 40s, and 50s that we have permanent settlement by people of French descent. And they'll start in Port Royal. There'll be other settlements. Increasingly, they spread along the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia, Western Nova Scotia. They'll spread to Grand Pré, which if there is any iconic Acadian site in the world, it's certainly Grand Pré, partly because it's so tied into the history of the deportation, worth visiting, and increasingly into Eastern New Brunswick in what would eventually become Fort Beau Séjour and other areas that would be contended for by different powers. So anyway, the population grows in the second half of the 17th century, and all the while you have these powers vying for control of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. The colony goes back and forth between France and England until we get to this point. And 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht, during the preceding war, Nova Scotia had fallen officially to the British. They had taken Port Royal, the French capital of Acadia, if you will. And from that point on until the 1750s, when we get another major war, it's really uncontested. The mainland of Nova Scotia is in British hands, and the bulk of the population, aside from the indigenous peoples who've already inhabited that land for quite a long time, the bulk of the population is French, and we might call them Acadians. It takes a while for the Acadian uh, the term Acadian to catch on, but it does over time. It's only, really past the deportation that it becomes commonly used. Until then, we talk about French settlers, French colonists, the French neutrals, very famously. It's a French population, even though there's a nascent identity there, the fact that they're not like the French of metropolitan France, or quite the same people as the French of Quebec. So all that to say that what we typically associate with the golden age of Acadia, of large families, peace, agricultural settlements, low mortality rates, few diseases, people building dikes to dry out land and build more farming acreage. All that, for the most part, well, not all that, but most of that happens under the British regime, which is something somewhat jarring for a lot of folks that, under the British regime, this people was able to, somewhat emancipate itself from European fetters. Uh, but that only is true until the end of this period, until the 1740s and 50s. And it's partly because the British don't have the power to assert their claim more strongly to Nova Scotia, meaning forcing Acadians to serve their new crown, to truly become loyal and to serve the British authorities in every way. Many times over the course of the 1720s, 30s, and 40s, the British tried to compel the Acadians to sign an oath of allegiance, saying that at a time of war, they will be faithful to the British crown, and therefore they'll be willing to take up arms for the crown, for their new rulers. And there are conditional oaths of allegiance, and there's wrangling, but the British are ultimately unable to push any threat they have until the 1740s and 50s. The situation becomes more critical during the two wars I have listed there in the middle, on the right-hand side, King George's War, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. And even though the British are very much interested in parceling out the Acadians' lands to people of British descent, to people from the 13 colonies, the reality is that they feel tremendously embattled, and it's partly because French governors based in Quebec City are pursuing a policy of encirclement. So they're trying to circle in and they're building new forts, notably in the Isthmus of Chignecto, which is basically the center of the map here, around Fort Gaspereau, Chignecto, Fort Lawrence, Fort Beauséjour. There's increasing competition at that frontier between the two empires in the 1740s and 50s. And the British feel increasingly, partly because they haven't had that leverage in the past, feel as though, they might have enemy aliens in their midst and people willing to take up arms against them. So because the Acadians are of French descent, they assume that they have some sort of ancestral obligation to fight for the French. The Acadians, for the most part, the documentary record is pretty clear. They want to be left alone. They want to be neutral. This is a fight between two powers, and they want to leave it to mercenaries and armies to figure it out while they're, tending to their garden, as Voltaire would later write. So that's, the preoccupation of the Acadians, and that's where we have the pressure being exerted by the Mi'kmaq people on the Acadians, telling them you have to pick up arms to fight against the British. So by the mid 1750s, things have come to a crossroads essentially, and the British now have the armies, uh, the fighting power, the ammunition, the supplies, the ships, and so forth to press their threat even further. So the mid 1750s, they will tell Acadians, you must take the oath of allegiance, or else what? You will be deported. And the French again refuse, through their deputies. They send deputies to Halifax, where the British are located, and they essentially say, no, we will not fight for the British, hoping that they would benefit from the same leniency they had benefited from in the 1720s, 30s, and 40s. That does not happen this time. So starting in the fall of 1755, the British will begin deporting about 17,000 people, 14,000 of which are Acadian. There's a great new book out by André Carl Vachon, who's done a numerical study of the deportation, and it's first of all it's an act of cruelty, of cultural decimation. The logistics, in some respects, are mind-boggling. The amount of effort the British went through and the expense to carry out this act of, again, cruelty that led to thousands and thousands of deaths, and yet it happens in the mid 1750s. So the deportation begins in the Grand Pré area, actually, and by the thousands, Acadians will be sent to Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. They're not sent directly to Louisiana. I should clarify that. That's a myth that we also encounter, that the British sent Acadians from Nova Scotia physically by ship to Louisiana. At that point in time, Louisiana was still French. So it wouldn't have made sense to send these French people from one colony to another where they could reinforce the enemy. So it's only after the war that the Acadians really start on their own deciding to head to Louisiana, partly because it was still a Catholic colony. So there's this great big dispersal of people, a tragic one, needless to say. And that's really the foundation of the Acadia or Acadian communities that we know today. This is a diasporic nation. Sometimes I hesitate to use the word nation, but people of a common ancestry with, different regional cultures, it's true, and different dialects at this point, but who have this common history and the sense of being one. So ultimately, after the war, after the dispersal, some Acadians will come back to their ancestral colony in the 1760s, especially there's Governor Michael Franklin in Nova Scotia who's going to invite the Acadians back. That's going to happen in Quebec as well. Governor Murray inviting Acadians to come to Quebec and settle there, where they will be, in principle, untroubled by any such event again. So they're invited back, but of course, all their lands have been either sold, sometimes at auction, or parceled out away to new colonists. So whereas prior to the deportation, these were predominantly agricultural communities. Now they have to settle on marginal lands by the sea, rocky outcrops, places that, can't really grow anything, either by virtue of their growing season, the rocky soil, just geographic location. So increasingly, you have all these maritime communities being built up, like Sitsikan and Caraquet in New Brunswick, Pubnico, uh, the Bay Saint Anne region in Nova Scotia, that are predominantly, again, maritime and will rely much more on fisheries than agriculture. So the whole world of Acadians is turned upside down. I mean, setting aside, which really we shouldn't, like just the cruelty and the loss of life, their entire way of life is upended, even when they're able to return to what had been their ancestral homeland. So this gives you a sense of where these Acadians were sent to. I always hesitate to use the passive voice. We know who was in charge of this. It was in order of Charles Lawrence, the then Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, supported by William Shirley. And the record is very clear in terms of who ordered all of this. So it wasn't an accident, it was planned. It was poorly planned also, but of course it reflected on how people viewed the Acadian population and the French neutrals, as they called them. So they end up all over the place, and eventually many of them do return to their ancestral lands, and some make their way to other Catholic colonies, specifically Quebec and Louisiana. And I promise we're getting to the Valley. We'll be there in just a moment, but I'll give you a sense of the families that do end up in our region. So this is not a great map. It was made years ago, but the arrows are very helpful in terms of understanding a very complicated story of people who were displaced by the deportation, who were not deported, but displaced by the deportation, and who ultimately ended up in our region. And some of these are very common names across the Acadian world, not only in Maine or Nova Scotia or New Brunswick, but even in Louisiana. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Cyr family and how they end up in the valley. But there are other very common Acadian names in our region: Cormier, Daigle, or Daigle, as they say in Fort Kent, Grivois, or Guidry, Martin. Martin is kind of a tricky one, because if you see Martin in northern Maine, they could be from Quebec, they could be from Old Acadia, or they could just be Anglo-Saxon Protestants coming up from Massachusetts Bay. Robichaud, Thériault, Thibodeau, of course, very common in Louisiana. We had somebody from Louisiana this morning at the Acadian Archives, and he was like, I see a lot of these names back home. And of course, we're all interrelated, those of us who have Acadian ancestry. And of course, Violet there at the end. So I mentioned that there are families that are not deported, but displaced by the deportation. I promise this is not splitting hairs. This is just a reflection of the challenges faced by a lot of families in the 1750s, some of which increasingly, they see the deportation coming. They see the winds of war, and they might have a little bit more capital than other families, but they're able to escape. And sometimes in very difficult circumstances, sometimes it's because their village just got burnt down. They live in the wilderness for a few months. They try to make their way to safer grounds. And typically those safer areas are those that are further west, by which we mean the St. Lawrence River Valley, where in the 1750s you have about 60 to 65,000 French Canadians, as compared to 14,000 Acadians. So that's where the basin of French population really is in North America. And they figure that even if there's conflict or clash over Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, maybe they'll be safer in New France. Maybe the heart of New France, Quebec, Montreal, that will hold off against British attacks. So in the 1750s, early 1750s, and even after the deportation has begun, some of those families flee. Some first go through Prince Edward Island, or l'Île Saint-Jean, as it was called under the French regime. They'll go through the Baie des Chaleurs and eventually go to Kamouraska. Others take a slightly different path, a more inland path. So they'll escape from Nova Scotia and go up the St. Croix River or the St. John River. So they'd go through St. John. Towards the bottom of the map, you can see St. John, or the present day city of St. John. So that's the mouth of the St. John River. And some are able to go upriver, portage, and eventually also end up in the lower St. Lawrence River region. Mostly, again, we say Kamouraska, but there are parishes on either side that also welcome Acadians. So again, this happens during the 7 Years' War for the most part, and a lot of these Acadian families that have escaped will remain there until the mid-1760s, until well after the end of the war, and they'll try to build new lives. But ultimately, we don't know just how welcome they are in their new parishes. There are some doubts about that, whether the local people in Kamouraska, which will face the winds of war in the late 1750s, whether they're happy about having these Acadian refugees in their midst. There are a lot of questions that still haven't been entirely investigated by scholars. And in some cases, there's just no documentary record. Also, that's a tough part. But it seems clear enough that a lot of these families, including some that I have listed on the left, they're not interested in staying permanently in Kamouraska. So around 1766, 67, 68, all the way to the end of the decade, slowly they'll trickle back south towards Sainte-Anne-des-Pays-Bas, which we also see there on the map. It's not as clear as it should be, but you can kind of make it out there, which is just outside of present-day Fredericton. And it's also located on the St. John River. It's also closer to the ancestral homeland of these Acadians. It's a landscape and a region they had known better. So the hope in the late 1760s is that they can build new lives in southern New Brunswick, between St. John and Fredericton. And that works for a while. They even get land grants. They're able to build new lives. Some of those regions are almost entirely French. So they're building a new Acadia, basically, in the heart of what is today New Brunswick, which is great on paper, until the American Revolutionary War, which upends a lot of things in North America. But as a result of that war, you have thousands and thousands of loyalists, people who have remained loyal to the British Crown in the 13 colonies, who are themselves refugees. Sometimes they've been tarred and feathered, they've lost their goods, or their goods have been confiscated simply by virtue of their political allegiances. Well, they're looking for a new home also by 1783. And in 1783, 84, you have the evacuation of New York, Charleston, Savannah, where they had a lot of loyalists living, a lot of loyalist families. They set their sights north. Some will end up in Britain, but for the most part, they end up in Canada, including Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So in 1783, you have a massive influx of thousands of loyalists coming into southern New Brunswick. And even though the Acadians, who've been displaced a few times at this point, even though they have title to their lands, they're looking ahead. They're looking at the next generation, their ability to find land for themselves, their children, their grandchildren, and to maintain their way of life. And as they see, I'm sure there was an element of trauma. As they see all these English speakers coming in, they're thinking, are we going to get displaced again? And so this speaks to the character of Acadians being resilient and, having gone through very difficult circumstances in Quebec and before that in Nova Scotia. They decided to take their fate into their own hands and to apply to the governor and say to the governor in Nova Scotia, we want new land grants and we want to be away from all this, basin of loyalist settlers. We want to be away from this. We want to find a place where we'll be secure permanently on our lands that we'll be able to provide for ourselves, where there'll be enough land to support the next generation, our grandchildren, and so forth, well into the future. And so there's a round of petitioning. They petition, as I said, to the governor in Nova Scotia. There's another governor in Quebec. And ultimately, thanks to the intersection of some of these Acadian deputies who go to Quebec, who go to these different centers of power, but also thanks to governors who are at least not as cruel as some of their predecessors, they're able to come to an agreement and to find land on the upper course of the St. John River, from which I'm joining you today. So finally, we're getting to the valley. It's only taken half an hour, and I appreciate your patience, but finally we're here. We're in the right place, and this is where we find the Acadian story that we know in northern Maine today. So lands are granted on both sides of the river. Now, today we know the St. John River in our region as being the border. That was not the case about 240 years ago. It was a loosely defined region following the Treaty of Paris, which gave the United States their independence. Um, so by giving lands to these Acadians on both sides of the river, these governors were being more than just benevolent. This was very much something that was planned, and it was an assertion of British sovereignty over both sides, basically claiming both sides of the river as being British. If we grant lands, then technically it's ours. We're asserting our own authority, suzerainty over both sides of the river. So there are two sides to that medal. The fact that, yes, they're acquiescing to Acadian demands and acknowledging that this is an act of justice, but also showing the Americans next door that this is actually British land. So all these families in the early 1780s, they've gotten the land grant, they've gotten the promise, they pack up their things in a semi-mythical moment in June of 1785. They pack up, they get into canoes. At that time, there are no roads to speak of, and the easiest, fastest means of conveyance really is on water. So there are no good roads, and even if they had built roads, it would have been mud half the year, or they would have been impassable at this point in time. So really, people rely on waterways for transportation. So they head upriver. They're already on the St. John River in Fredericton. They come to this region, and basically they start settling and building homesteads in the region a little bit further east from present-day Edmundston. And this is a copy of a map, not Google Maps, the one at the top, but the one at the bottom, that's held at the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick. And luckily, we have a copy here at the archives. It's the one that we scanned to get this lovely image. And it gives you a sense of the landscape and the assertion of, British authority, the fact that they're carving out this land, regardless of what's actually on the land, meaning terrain, meaning other, whether there might be hills and ponds and any obstructions to human settlement. They're basically imposing this grid upon the St. John Valley. And unfortunately, we had to scale down the image, but on this image, you see the original land grants given to the Cyr family, the Thibodeau family, the Daigles. There are a few Hébert or Hébert or Heberts, all depending on where you're from, and predominantly Acadian names once again. And it's really neat, and it's really a powerful experience for people to come into the archives here, and not only to learn about their family history, but then to be able to hop on the road and to drive down and be able to point to a certain landmark and say, this was my family's plot of land a few centuries back. So it's quite powerful, and a lot of this is still recognizable. You'll see a roughly square area on the left-hand side of the map. It says Indian Reserve, and that reservation is still there today, and it belongs to the Madawaska Maliseet First Nation, just outside of Edmundston, New Brunswick. So there's a lot of continuity in this map, down to the family names, and it's hard to, you can't throw a rock out here, not that you would, without hitting a Daigle or a Thibodeau or a Cyr or a Violet. And that's true of a lot of Acadian communities, of course, as I mentioned earlier. So people come here, allegedly for the first time in the summer of 1785. The story is a little bit more complicated because they would have come here according to some written records in late June. Well, they're going to get their first frost 2.5 months later. It's not enough time to start planting and to have enough crops to get through the following winter. So there's another story here. It may be that they had begun to chop down trees and clear land the summer prior, even if the petitions weren't sure to work out in their favor. Or it might just be that that first summer they come up here and they start chopping down trees and making land and building um, little cabins. After which, maybe the following summer, the rest of the crew, meaning families, full families, women and children, come up in their wake. So there's a little bit more to explore there, but unfortunately, the documentary record is extremely sparse when it comes to those first semi-mythical years of the Madawaska settlement. So that settlement is still honored today. These are recent pictures taken by a former geography professor at the University of New Hampshire, or at least the one on the left is. And that site, the alleged Acadian landing site from 1785, is honored. The reality is we have a rough idea where the first homestead were built. This is probably not the exact location, but it's still a proper act of memory, honoring the people who came here as part of that initial wave of settlers from the lower course of the St. John River. And some of the family names that I've mentioned a few times already appear on this plaque, which is at the base of the Acadian landing site cross that we have here on the screen. So there's still a lot in our region to explore that honors the first families. But the story is, as it always is, it's more complicated, and it's certainly complicated by what happens in following decades. Specifically, the arrival of French Canadians. So we've been talking about Acadians, meaning those who had inhabited colonial Acadia, Eastern New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Now, in the colonial period and up until until the 1860s, Canada only refers to the area from Quebec west, right? Nobody would have referred to Nova Scotia as Canada in the 1750s. So when we talk about French Canadians, we're talking about people from the St. Lawrence River Valley who would have been somewhat distinct by that point from the populations of Acadia. So starting in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, you have these waves of French Canadians coming into the region. And it's partly because of overpopulation. It's partly because of agricultural challenges that people in the St. John Valley are also facing. And you have a lot of young men coming to the St. John Valley to work as loggers, farm laborers, to provide wage labor on a part-time basis. And eventually they meet Acadian women, they marry into those families, and vice versa. Eventually you'll have French Canadian women coming with fathers and brothers and so forth who marry into Acadian families. So there's this mixing, and that's partly where the term, I use the term hybrid. It's a francophone hybrid community, meaning the meeting of two different francophone worlds, French Canadian and Acadian. And, a lot of the names that we have in our region are Acadian, many more are French Canadian. So over time, they build, communities. They build like really prosperous farms in some cases. They build churches. There's institutional infrastructure that comes to be as very slowly, the colony begins to become more prosperous. And it takes decades, partly because initially, for instance, this is just a quick example. Initially, they're planting wheat. Well, wheat doesn't fare well in the somewhat rocky, somewhat acidic soil of northern Maine, where you have 4 months maybe between frosts, from May until September. You don't have a whole lot of time and you have late frosts in the spring, early frosts in the fall. So climatic conditions aren't great. Geological conditions aren't great. And you just have different strands of wheat that aren't adapted to the specific conditions of the St. John Valley. And yet, for a few decades, they're really committed because that's all they had known before. They had grown wheat in Kamouraska. They had grown wheat in Nova Scotia. So they have to adapt. And they do adapt over time. But after famine and after a lot of reversals with regard to agriculture. So increasingly they'll shift to buckwheat. Buckwheat is not technically wheat, for one thing, despite the name. It's technically a weed, but it fares really well, and it can, yield the flour that goes into bread and all sorts of other things, including ploys, for those who are familiar with that dish. So they adapt, and eventually they'll adapt and integrate potatoes and peas and just other crops that are a little bit more hardy. That takes time. So again, it takes time to build prosperous communities up here. And eventually, what will make a huge difference is the influx of outside capital. And that starts to happen in the 1830s, 1840s. What I mean by that is that increasingly you have merchants coming in. Some are Canadian, they're coming from St. John or Fredericton, settling in the region. You have some coming from southern Maine or even Massachusetts. They're coming to the region. They're bringing in capital and they're bringing in networks, commercial networks. So they're able to establish a supply line. If they open up a little business, a little shop, then they have connections further downstate and they can import supplies to the region. That's a part of it. The other part of it is that you have larger commercial concerns that are focused on timber exploitation. Um, and so you'll have these large, increasingly large conglomerates, and they'll hire young French Canadian and Acadian men in the St. John Valley to go into the woods, especially during the winter. Winter is a slow season in agricultural communities, and goodness knows we have a lot of winter in northern Maine. So for about 6 months, some of these men can go out into the woods and earn extra wages simply by cutting down trees. And they'll be an essential component of yarding crews and logging crews in northern Maine and northwestern New Brunswick for generations and generations, all the way into the 1960s. And still today, logging is a big business in northern Maine, thanks in part to Irving Woodlands. So the point being that these commercial concerns and the fact that there's a lot of interest, commercial interest in logging, that brings money into these communities, physical money that they can spend, and that will help improve their way of life, partly because they can buy metal stoves or cast iron stoves, or they can buy tea and coffee and so forth. And make all sorts of improvements to their homes. What we have on the left here is a reproduction of what would have been, well, I say reproduction, I'll back up a little bit. This home dates from about 1800, late 1790s, 1800. Um, but it's very similar to what they would have built even further back in Nova Scotia and southern New Brunswick. But eventually that style changes, and it's partly because people are able to make improvements and have different rooms and have central heating and proper chimneys where they're not, doing all their cooking, so they can move some of those functions to different places around the house. Um, so that happens very slowly, as I said, over the course of generations in the 19th century. They build mills, and increasingly large industrial concerns will take interest in the region. The railway won't come to the region until really the end of the 19th century. If memory serves right, the railway reaches Fort Kent, where I'm located, in 1903. And that's just a testament to the remoteness of the region. And part of it is that the train isn't quite as essential as we might imagine it to be, because again, people are using waterways for transportation, and especially for log drives. So it's not like they're putting all these logs, as they do today, on these giant, immense trains um, and rail cars. It's happening on the water. So all that interest in timber, especially into logging, leads to the Aroostook War. We call it the Aroostook War. It's a convention in history to call it the Aroostook War. By any other definition, it's not a war. Partly because, really, to speak of, there's no bloodshed. Um, I don't know, people might have killed a few moose or a few deer. That might be the extent of it. The reality is that it's a circle or a cycle of retaliation between British and American officers in the region. Each are trying to lay claim to the region. So the Acadians that had lived a somewhat undisputed life in the St. John Valley for a few generations, for close to 50 years at that point, suddenly find themselves embroiled once again in an international conflict. And it's because you have American companies and British timber companies fighting over all of these large timber grants, timber reserves. And that leads to, as I said, a clash. And it's mostly American officials arresting British officials on what they perceive to be American soil and vice versa. And that happens for a few years. There is an element of militarization. So both sides will muster troops and send proper armies, like thousands and thousands of men, to the region on both sides. And they will build these blockhouses to defend the respective regions. And again, as an act of colonial sovereignty or an assertion of sovereignty over the Upper St. John Valley. The only one that's original to the conflict is the one in the aptly named Fort Kent. So that's the one on the left, bottom left, and it's been standing now for 100 and about 80 years. I'll round up a little bit. About 20 years ago in Edmundston, they rebuilt Le Petit Fortin, or the blockhouse they had there. That's the one at the top of the screen. So that is very much a reproduction, but a really neat one and worth visiting. And the same goes for the one in Fort Fairfield at the bottom right. That is a reproduction, but there had been one in Fort Fairfield at that time in the 1830s and 40s. And finally, fortunately, without further bloodshed or any kind of bloodshed really, the border dispute is resolved in 1842 with the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, sometimes called the Treaty of Washington. And from that point on, the boundary is set. And from roughly Grand Falls, New Brunswick, to St. Francis in Maine, the boundary will match exactly the course of the St. John River. And in fact, both sides have free access to the river as per the terms of that treaty. So you can walk all the way across the river or paddle all the way across the river if you're an American. And as long as you're not touching Canadian soil, you're safe. So you can enjoy the full width of the river, if you will, which is pretty neat. And people have been taking advantage of that for a long time. And certainly was very useful to both British and American logging concerns in the 1830s and 40s. They would both want to push their lumber down the waterway. So that's a small snapshot of the Aroostook War, which again could be an entire 15-week course. We can talk about it in the question period. So these are just a few cool items I wanted to share. I know we don't have a whole lot of time left, and in fact, I'll be wrapping up very shortly, partly for everyone's sake. But there are a lot of really cool items in our collections, including these. The first is, as you can see, is from the State Land Office, granting lands specifically to people of Acadian descent. So finally, northern Maine and northwestern New Brunswick, Acadians can access land properly in their own name, purchase those lands. And I should mention also really quickly that following the Treaty of Webster-Ashburton in 1842, very wisely, the American side, the American authorities recognized the original land grants given by the British to Acadians on the southern side of the river. So they're not displaced again. They recognize Acadians' right to those lands on what is now American soil. But you can see a lot of Acadian names here, including Sear and Violet, Thibodeau as well. And, further down you have a Dumont. I don't know what Zellerford. I think that's an anglicization of a French name. I've never seen Zellerford before, but that person is at Dumont. And you have Siren King, also just slightly above that. Maybe it was Siren Roy, because we do have a lot of Roys in our region. We'll skip over this again in the interest of time, but there are a lot of cool pieces of correspondence in our collection that I'd love to share, and hopefully we'll be able to welcome all of you at some point to the Acadian Archives here in Northern Maine. I do want to acknowledge, and again, I'll close very shortly. I want to acknowledge other cultures, like my talk here is focusing specifically on people of Acadian and French Canadian descent, partly because in a lot of these communities all along the St. John River on the American side, for the longest time, about 80%, sometimes 90% of people were of French descent somehow, whether they were connected to Quebec or to colonial Acadia. So they really formed the heart of the culture, the mainstream, cultural mainstream up in northern Maine was French and Catholic. That's a big part of it also. But I want to acknowledge the Scots-Irish community in Allagash. You have that star there on the left that represents that culture. It's very unique, and still today, that's the English end of the valley, not too far from Fort Kent. And they have their unique subculture, and some of them still speak with an Irish brogue. It's really cool. So they've been somewhat insulated for a few hundred years. I've mentioned the Wolastoqiyik or Maliseet people, and just a little bit further down the road on Route 161, we have the Swedish colony. In the 1880s and 1890s, we have an influx of Swedes in northern Maine, and so they found New Sweden and Stockholm. There's another small town that doesn't have a Swedish name or Swedish connection, but is nearby and also has a large Swedish population. And nowadays, of course, it's, even more so uh, diversified, partly because of Edmundston, which is a fairly significant urban center. But here at the University of Maine at Fort Kent, we welcome people from all over the place. We have students from about 30 different countries around the world. So it's really neat that within the larger Francophone or French heritage population, we still have these connections to the wider world in a level of diversity that we've never enjoyed before. And people get to encounter Acadians on their own own terms and in their own communities. So there's a lot to explore in those regards. Uh, I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of arguably the most significant piece of legislation to affect northern Maine and the Acadian communities up here, which is the Maine language law. I won't have you read all this. I certainly won't read all this to you. But basically, it says that from this point on, meaning 1919 onwards, that the basic language of education in public schools would be English, meaning that from that point on, other subjects would have to be taught in English because in a lot of schools in the Valley, for a time, teachers would use a lot of French to teach math and things that people had to know history and their catechism and so forth. And this law was implemented specifically to assimilate and anglicize the population of northern Maine. Even though it says private schools here, the reality is that it was really only enforced in public schools for all sorts of reasons because there were strings attached with regard to state funds. And most of the schools in our region were, in fact, public schools. So even though nuns often or religious orders were hired to teach in public schools as civil servants, the reality is that they were still public schools and not denominational schools per se. And this law would remain on the books for 50 years. It would have a huge impact on the transmission of the language, meaning the French language specifically. It would take quite a while to recover from that. There have since been bilingual education programs implemented, but the psychological effect of that law of devaluing French has had a long-lasting impact, and it's still being felt today. In Fort Kent, unfortunately, today, the French language isn't being taught until seventh grade, and then it's only a third or a quarter of the year, and then young people who are entirely of French descent in some cases won't see the French language until they're in ninth grade, which is really way too late. And that's a reflection of some people's priorities, perception of the language, the fact that people don't see it as a necessity or, an essential component of their culture anymore. So that's very much a legacy of this time period. Oh, I'm trying to move ahead here. Let's see if I can do it. There we go. Eric, out of curiosity, how much time do I have?
Um,
Or should I wrap up?
a few minutes. It's about 3 minutes too. So a few people will have to leave undoubtedly right around 1 o'clock. But you should probably wrap up now and get into the questions.
Okay, I appreciate that, which I'm very much looking forward to. Mentioned really quickly on this slide, moment of transition, the building of bridges in the St. John Valley in the late 1910s, 1920s. Until then, there are no bridges across the international border, across the river. It's all ferries. And the fact that now traffic is being narrowed to specific points, to bridges in Van Buren, Madawaska, and Fort Kent, enables the Border Patrol and the Border Service and other entities that we today call the USCIS and border enforcement, they're able to focus their attention to specific crossing points and to regulate traffic to a far greater extent, which would have a large impact in the short term, but we've certainly felt it in the 21st century, especially in the wake of 9/11 and then with COVID and the border restrictions that have come of that. A few changes that have occurred in the last 60 years. I'm brushing with a very broad brush now, but there's a lot more to explore, and we can talk about it now or at a later date. The influx of federal funds, partly thanks during the Cold War to Loring Air Force Base, which is just down the road in Limestone. Eric was sharing earlier the fact that he grew up in Connecticut, where at one time there was a large French Canadian population. A big part of that population came in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s as thousands of people from the St. John Valley left the valley for lack of opportunity and went to work in the aerospace industry. Lockheed Martin and a few other big outfits hired a lot of people from the St. John Valley. So we've had a rural exodus now for the better part of 70 years and a brain drain as well, people leaving to take advantage of educational opportunities elsewhere. And matching that at the same time, we've had an economic transition where we're a lot less dependent on potatoes and logging and some of those traditional commercial activities. We're a lot more reliant now on tourism and leisure activities. We have the Can-Am sled dog race every year. We have the biathlon. A lot of folks, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people come up every year to snowmobile in some of our trails. That's not including the entire cultural component, museums, historical societies, lovely archives, a lot of cultural infrastructure in our region on both sides of the river. This is not unique to Maine, but in northwestern New Brunswick, that is also true. And of course, you can see from the little chart there on the right that Van Buren has suffered for that depopulation and lack of opportunity, as well as some business concerns leaving the region. And Van Buren isn't unique, although it's perhaps felt it a little bit more than other towns around the region. Northern Maine today, I've talked a lot of this, so I won't repeat myself in the interest of making the most of our time together so we can have a good exchange and Q&A session. We remain tied to New Brunswick and Quebec, but a lot of folks in our region, despite those ancestral ties across the river, identify predominantly as American. They will typically use Acadian well before they do French or Franco-American or French-Canadian. So that moniker Acadian is still holds a lot of weight culturally. It's still very significant to people in our region. However, increasingly, as we pass from one generation to the next, one thing that perhaps isn't being passed, to use that same metaphor, is the torch of culture. And we worry about the next generation being, not necessarily not identifying with its roots, partly because they are bathing in an Acadian environment, but with the loss of language and people moving away, it becomes much less of a priority, and it's becoming a struggle for certain cultural institutions to maintain their service or level of support from the community. But we still have a lot of infrastructure. Case in point is the World Acadian Congress that was held here just barely more than 10 years ago in 2014. Some of you might have had a chance to enjoy it. The World Acadian Congress is held in different places every 5 years. And this was the first time that a World Acadian Congress was held astride an international boundary. So it included the Témiscouata region of Quebec, northwestern New Brunswick, and northern Maine, and that made it all the more special. So normally at this point, I would start talking about the Acadian archives. We have a lot of really cool stuff to share with you. What I shared today is just a very broad brush picture of the history of the region using a few of our resources, a few of our maps and pieces of correspondence and so forth. But we have a lot, and especially for those of you who have Acadian history in your family, Acadian ancestors, really, there's a lot we can do to support you in your research and to help spread the word about the amazing Francophone culture of Northern Maine. Sorry, I'm being buzzed here. I'll turn off my mic. But anyway, that's the close of my talk, and I look forward to a lot of questions.
Yeah.
One thing, thank you very much for a really fine presentation. One thing that I personally wanted to underscore, and when I say personally, is My mother-in-law grew up and was born in that period of time when the language laws came in. So it wasn't just a matter that the current generation has lost the interest or the generations before lost interest in it. They were shamed every time they spoke French. So it wasn't just, well, in public education, you got to use it now. It's thou shalt not speak French. And in one generation, they went from being primarily Francophone to being Anglophone.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, it's tremendously sad when you can't communicate with basically your ancestors and your family in what should be your maternal tongue, when that's been lost. And that's, you know, you've really hit it spot on with the psychological aspect for one thing, and the way people feel about their language, especially if they're made to write "I shall not speak French" 100 times on the board, or they're getting their knuckles rapped over it. Um, you're entirely right. So it's you know, in some cases, it's a conscious decision because parents are like, I don't want my children to go through what I had to go through in school.
Yeah.
But of course, it's a decision that shouldn't have to be made in the first place. Um, and that's happened in a lot of different places. And in the St. John Valley, we have kind of a unique situation, partly because educational system was so decentralized that you had one-room schoolhouses and some places, maybe further out in the outskirts, where that was just never applied. And I was interviewing one of our community members who's now I think he's 86, who lived through this period. He grew up in the 1940s, and it was like I didn't even know that law was on the books. And he grew up in St. Agatha, just half an hour from here. But
Yeah.
you know, that experience is much more exceptional. And your point is very well taken, that was applied very much so in a lot of schools around Maine. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah. Yeah. If there if for others with questions, if you could unmute yourselves and chime in, not everybody at once. Okay,
Yeah, I think
This is David Graham
yeah.
from Newport, Vermont. And one thing I'd like to do is thank Patrick for his presentation. People like Patrick and others who I'm not going to name because I'll forget somebody, are those people with hair of a different color than mine. In other words, not white or gray, who are serving to keep the Franco-American and Franco-Canadian, Franco-Acadian connection alive throughout the Northeast. And if it wasn't for them, we'd be in a much different situation than we currently are. And so I would like to thank Patrick again for his wonderful presentation today.
that's very kind, David. I always enjoy chatting with you, and you know, we trade emails and messages back and forth. And sometimes I'm a little jealous because he goes off and, you know, explores northern Vermont and the eastern townships, and I'm much further away from what is, you know, my ancestral community in the eastern townships. But it's always great to hear from David, who himself has done a lot as a teacher. So thank you a lot.
Yeah, yeah. I have a question which relates to in the 19th century and subsequently when the river became the international boundary. With your early maps, it's very clear that there are families that are dispersed or have land on either side of the river. And so to what extent did this break up families, break up connections, break up probably just as important exchange networks through kin networks along the valley, and how it evolved as the border became more of a rigid border.
Right. I will say in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, there's no enforcement to speak of. You know, it's one of those paper dragons, I suppose, where, you know, we're creating a boundary, but and they do you know, the federal government does appoint customs agents and inspectors at several locations, but it's really their role is commercial. they're not trafficking who crosses and when, unless they're bringing anything of value, anything that's being regulated. So the first hint that we have that there is really proper regulation comes in the late 1910s, 1920s. There's really no proper border apparatus until the 1920s. That's when the Border Patrol comes into being. And even then, really that doesn't change much in terms of families' relationships across the border. The biggest change that occurred was, more than a century and a half later, in the wake of 9/11, when admission requirements changed, and increasingly there was the expectation that people would have a passport, even though for a while you could still get across with a birth certificate and a driver's license and so forth. Um, um, so that's where we felt the greatest impact. And certainly, as new situations have emerged, it's become more difficult for families to maintain ties across the border, partly because over time, um, land was passed down through different branches of the family. So you didn't have a single person owning a piece of land that stretched across the river, and they would build families in their respective communities. Um, about 2.5 years ago, we conducted our own little oral history project here at the archives, partly because we wanted to capture people's experience of the pandemic while it was fresh in their minds and their experience. And especially from the perspective of a borderland region where people do still maintain ties, despite what I just said. I mean, there are still people who will cross the border for work or who will have an aunt, a grandparent, even a parent across the border. And I mean, we're a little bit selective in the people we chose for our interviews. It was people who had maintained those ties historically. And we heard just devastating, we might even call them horror stories about not being able to attend a parent's funeral, you know, a mile away. Like you could see where the funeral home was. You just couldn't cross. And that lasted for a year and a half. And even in the wake of that, uh, people just stopped paying attention in a sense. And for a while, you had to have the ArriveCan app on your smart device. A lot of folks who don't have a smart device, who might be a little bit older, not necessarily, but in some cases, and I say this as somebody who has this in his pocket. So, this is not a judgment for people who don't have a smart device. But I point that out because they just stopped paying attention and they were like, well, I'll never be able to cross again. And I have family in the Eastern Townships in Southern Quebec who just gave me a little stack of money. It wasn't a whole lot, but American money. And they were like, well, we'll never use this again. So you take it if you're going to be able to cross. And so we have all these experiences of people being like, well, I don't feel welcome anymore. And some people had that experience 20 years ago when they felt as though questions and the experience at the border was becoming too intrusive. But really, I would add that that's a 21st century experience. And for the longest time, even into, until 2001, 2002, people would go to the border. For one thing, the border agents were all from the community. So they shared laughs and they were like, oh, how's Metal so? And how's Monok this and that? So, there was that exchange. So it's really the last 20 to 25 years that that's changed. But until then, it was very fluid, to give a very long-winded answer to a very good question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and actually related to that, I read somewhere that during Prohibition, the borders in northern Vermont became more heavily manned against smugglers. And I would imagine that it was that along the St. Johns River would also be an area of prohibition, smuggling, etc.
That's right. And in fact, the border apparatus that I talk about emerging in the 1920s is a belated response to the fact that now that we have prohibition, we actually have to enforce it, and we have a lot of liquor coming in from Montreal and Halifax and some of these other places.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, there's Richard Talbot raised his hand. Richard.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name's Richard Talbot, and I'm from Londonderry, New Hampshire. And I came up and visited Patrick and seen Patrick about 5 years ago at the up at the school there at Fort Kent, and it was pretty amazing. I'm totally involved in my ancestry of my background, and mostly through my father's family. It kind of carries up through Maine up into northern Maine. So I'm still working on a lot of the connections because of the deportation. It makes my ancestry work. And I also bumped into a gentleman up there who was at the school, who's a French teacher, Mr. Daigle, and we sat in a room and had a really great time. I was up there for close to a week, and Patrick, you're just that was an amazing presentation. I always learned something. I learned a lot when I came up there, and you spoke with me a little bit. Again, I'll remember you. Might not remember me, but that's okay. Um, I there's some things that I've noticed through my ancestry work that are really kind of neat, and I can't imagine you not being aware of it. But going along with all of what you've talked about the conflicts that have gone on and everything, there was these things that they used to post on windows of restaurants and stores that say "Ici on parle français," and I didn't know if you had anything that maybe you might want to say about that, because there was a specific article that I read and it blew me away. But I just want to say hi to you again. Nice to see you again. Um, I'm hoping to come up and maybe see you again sometime up at the archives there, and I'm just tickled pink. I'm amazed at your passion. That's the biggest thing. I see the passionate stuff that you have about this. Um, I have to say that if there's anything that I know that I got in common with you, it's that right now. There's a warmth that I feel doing my ancestry work that I've never felt before. And trust me, when I was growing up, history was my worst subject. I didn't, to me, I was young. I had things to do, places to go, people to see. History wasn't interesting to me. So maybe it's just a sign of me just being old, that I like history now, whatever it is. But I just want to say thank you for the time that you very much were welcoming to me when I came up there. So thanks.
I appreciate that. That's very kind. Um, I do remember, and I think you spoke quite a bit with our archivist, Madeline, who's still at the archives and does an amazing job, has skills that I don't have, for one thing. So thank you for visiting, and I hope that that's going to be an indirect invitation to other folks in the group to come and see us in Fort Kent. And I will mention, regarding history as a subject, we notice at the archives, and I'm sure this is true in many other centers across the Northeast and beyond, it takes a while for people to connect with their roots. Like what we do now, we have a lot of tour groups. We had one group of students coming in this morning. We do a lot of educational work, and all we're doing is planting seeds. That's all we can do. We're not assuming that these are all going to become historians, although they should, that they're going to be committed, for the rest of their lives. It's cyclical. And what we notice is that the people who start taking interest, who are like coming to the archives for the first time, typically they're in their 50s, if we're lucky, late 40s, 50s, 60s. And what they're doing is that, they have elderly parents that they're taking care of, and their parents might be downsizing, or they're realizing, well, I might only have a few more years with my father, my mother, and they start hearing stories, and maybe stories that they've always heard, but now they're really listening. Now they're listening. And so it's only once people get to middle age that they have, maybe it's partly life experience or having greater perspective or just wanting to have something to pass on to the next generation. So there is, French would say, a relève, meaning, passing of the torch to the next generation, but we don't see them until they're in their 40s or 50s or a little bit further along.
Yeah.
But we'll take anyone, and that's okay also. When you're busy raising children and ferrying them to school and taking care of other family members and so forth, it's hard to have that perspective and just the time to devote to your own history and your place in the larger cultural world. So thank you. And you asked about the On parle français signs. So that's a product of a movement that emerged in the 1990s, 1993 to be very specific. Excuse me. And it was the movement to save our French, and that was what it was called. And it was partly organized by Judy Parody, Some of you might recognize the name. She was a state senator for a long time. She's still very much involved in our community. Excuse me. And Mark Chassé, who was a longtime videographer. There were a lot of local notables in our region. And as a result of that movement, that grassroots movement, the next year they created Le Club Français, which, as you can probably guess, is now celebrating its 30th anniversary. Le Club Français is doing a great job. We have someone here in the group I saw, Mr. Schaefer, Nicholas Schaefer. He's, I think, attended a few of their meetings. He certainly visited the region, and they do a great job. And most of their focus when it comes to saving our French, as they used to say, has to do with educational programs. But it's been very difficult because they have to deal with school boards and all sorts of politics and funding. And it's not easy to make greater space in a curriculum that's already chock full. That's a lot more focus on math and science and STEM fields for the humanities and languages. And we face that on a university campus as well. Increasingly, just because of the cost of education, young people aren't necessarily looking, even though if ideally that's what they would get, they're not looking for a well-rounded liberal arts education that also happens to have science. They're looking increasingly for technical degrees, vocational degrees, where they're going to be done in 4 years and they're going to make a good living and they're going to start paying off that student debt. So, they're very hard economic circumstances that we're fighting against when it comes to bringing more of the French language and more of culture into these educational settings. So not easy, but again, I just want to pay tribute since you offer me that tribune, Mr. Talbot, to honor and recognize what's been done with Le Club Français in our region. As you say, for a long time they had those signs in the windows. A lot of the businesses have taken them down just because of new management and new businesses opening that didn't have the signs and so forth. But there's still a pretty big commitment, especially among an older generation, to the French language in the Valley.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. And well, thank you. If you look through the chat, there are a variety of people that make reference. A lot of people who are here, some of whom are still here, make reference to their to ancestors, Acadian ancestors and the like. Actually, I have one last question, if I may.
Sure.
We
Yes.
can just take a very brief answer, and that is, to what extent is French still actively spoken across the river in New Brunswick? Or has that been pretty much replaced by English?
No, until recently, let's say until maybe 2010, Edmundston was 85, 90% French. And it was and arguably still is the language, the mainstream language, the everyday language of communication in Edmundston. Even more so as you get out of Edmundston and into smaller parishes on in either direction on the New Brunswick side of the river. Little places like Saint-François, Saint-Hilaire, Sainte-Anne. The names kind of give it away, but these were Acadian and French Canadian Catholic communities. And in those places, a well-meaning tourist who might just only speak French would struggle to get along, or maybe not get along, but get the service that they're expecting.
Yeah.
So, and I say that it's changed a little bit in the case of Edmundston, partly because, especially with COVID, a lot of people moving out of Toronto, out of Halifax, out of Montreal, they're looking for mid-sized cities with more affordable housing. So you have a lot of people, coming in who don't necessarily speak the language, and you have international immigrants whose default language, if it's not their own native language, is English. So it's changing a little bit. But this is still one of the most francophone regions of New Brunswick, alongside the Acadian Peninsula, and definitely far more so than Moncton. Moncton is maybe 50-50 if we're generous. But if you're going to find French anywhere in New Brunswick, you're certainly going to find it in just across the river, just half a kilometer from me.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, why don't we wrap up? This is the conversation is going on for a bit, and people are having to leave. And of course, all of this has all been recorded, and it will be on the Alliance website in YouTube, well, the Alliance folder in YouTube in a couple of days. And I just want to, there are lots of thank yous, but I want to express my thank you from the part of the Alliance here in Burlington, and for all of us who have learned a lot and filled in a whole lot more. So with that, I will, why don't we wrap things up? Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.